Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of the Northern California Center. We welcome you to this special and very important program looking at the crisis facing Asians in America and what can be done, as the hashtags say, to stop Asian hate. Today, we bring the President and CEO of Asia Society, Kevin Rudd, together with two Asian American alumni of our Asia 21 Young Leaders Network. Both of these leaders have been advocates for the Asian American community long before this recent outbreak of racism, and they are powerful voices now. Before we get started, a quick note about an upcoming event. Here in California, we're gearing up for our Asia Game Changer West Awards. Tomorrow night, we will stand in solidarity with Asians and Asian Americans by honoring the remarkable contributions they have made to the community and across the globe. The gala is tomorrow, April 8th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 5 p.m. here on the West Coast. It's virtual, so you can join from any time zone across the globe. Now, let's get right to this program. In the wake of the coronavirus outbreak in the US, we witnessed an outbreak of racism against Asians, initially against Chinese and Chinese Americans in particular, singled out by people who blamed them for the origins of the virus itself. We at Asia Society have held several discussions and programs about xenophobia. Within this year, there have been some 4,000 documented incidents of racism against Asians in America, many of them recently taking the form of violent attacks. And that's 4,000 documented incidents. There are many more undocumented. So what can we do? Joining us today, Sylvia Kim, General Partner of SarahCap Cares, an impact-driven fund unleashing the power of technology for good and investing in early-stage technologies that reduce disparities and empower the underserved. She's a former human rights lawyer with more than 15 years of experience in human rights advocacy, strategic planning, and fund development. She co-founded a human rights organization for North Korea Human Rights, led the Orange County expansion of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and launched the country's first national Asian American Community Foundation. She's also an Asia 21 Young Leader from the class of 2016. Bing Chen is an entrepreneur, creator, and community builder. He is the general partner and co-founder of Aum Group, that's spelled A-U-M, a multicultural film fund. He's also chairman and co-founder of Gold House, a collective of pioneering Asian founders, creative voices, and leaders dedicated to forging stronger bonds within the Asian diaspora. He also serves as a board director and senior advisor to several of the world's most promising digital media companies, including Google's Global Marketing Board. Before that, Bing was YouTube's global head of creator development and management, and he is a member of the Asia 21 class of 2019. And our moderator today is Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia, and now President and CEO of the Asia Society. Kevin will lead this conversation and leave some time for your questions, and we would love to hear from you. If you do have questions, put them in the chat box, either on YouTube or Facebook. You can tweet them using the hashtag Asia Society Live. That's the hashtag Asia Society Live. Or you can email them to moderator@asiasociety.org. That's moderator@asiasociety.org. And with that, Kevin Rudd, off to you.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you for introducing our program today. And it's good to be with both Bing and with Sylvia. We look forward to this discussion very much. The Asia Society, we take this matter deadly seriously. And that's because for so many Asian Americans, this is potentially deadly. This is just a horrendous outbreak of racial violence against a much cherished community within the United States family, within the American family. And we were founded as an institution way back in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. Back in 1956, 3 years after the end of the Korean War, when there was also a whole lot of sentiment in the United States way back then about Chinese Americans, about Asian Americans in general. And so we believe it's in the DNA of our institution, the Asia Society, proudly to stand in absolute solidarity with Asian Americans whenever they come under any attack. In any civilized society, any form of racism against African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, or any other group within our society is by definition repugnant and illegal. Therefore, and that's one of the reasons why, as President and CEO of the Asia Society, I've directed the institution to now take a leading role in rolling back the tide, which is now moving in the reverse direction in the United States. A word or two just about my own experience of this in America. You might say, what's this Australian dude know about all this stuff? Particularly given during the COVID period, I've been living outside the United States. I hope to return to the United States when we open our building in New York later this year. But I follow the events in the US carefully. I follow them closely. And even before I left, let me just begin our discussion with both Bing and Sylvia with this small anecdote. I was visiting a friend in the hospital in Midtown East, not far from where I live. She was a visiting Australian, had a terrible injury on the subway and was recovering. Not a violent attack, it was just an accident. But as I was walking home from visiting her and her mother one day in the hospital, just before COVID began to emerge as a physical problem on the streets of New York, I was walking literally back along the street, and then I heard this person shout out and scream. A young Caucasian male scream at an old, subsequently discovered Chinese gentleman, get out of our country, get the expletive out of our country, go back to where you came from. We don't want you here. And the older man was just shaken by this. Partly because there's an element of the crazy brave in me. I then stormed across the street, hurled expletive deletives at the young Caucasian male and told him to go away in a particular form of expression. He looked stunned, the Chinese American looked stunned, he slunk away. And for me, it was a pretty interesting example of what it means in terms of standing in solidarity with Asian Americans when you see this or encounter it on the streets. Just after that, 15 seconds later, this big, burly Caucasian American then comes storming towards me. And I thought, hello, I'm about to be knocked out in one hit. And unlike Bing, who looks as though he goes to the gym regularly and could stand up and defend himself in the streets, I am not a pugilist by either training or predisposition. This guy came steaming towards me. I thought he was going to king hit me. But he said, thank you for standing up for this man, because the attack on him was un-American. And then he went on to say, I was in uniform. I fought in Iraq. We fought to defend liberties, civil liberties, and being a decent country. So strange things happen on the streets, but that was my small experience of this 12 months ago. My last comment before I turn to both Sylvia and Bing for our discussion, which I'll be moderating, is simply this. I read the New York Times, I read other American media, and I've seen this catalogue of events, of incidents, of attacks. Margaret mentioned 4,000. That's a very big number, and they're the ones that have been reported. Imagine those which are not being reported because people are too frightened to report them. So therefore, we have a problem, America. We have a problem on our hands, and therefore it's time that together we dealt with it. Sylvia, to you first, have you been surprised by this outbreak over the last 12 months, or did you see it coming?
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you again to Asia Society and to Asia 21 for this opportunity. I'll be honest that I am not that surprised. And actually, this is a perfect segue just to talk a little bit, I think, about the long history of anti-Asian sentiment and xenophobia here in the United States. A lot of times, I think this past year, there's been a lot more awareness of it. It's the first time I think that there's been so many viral documentations, videos, pictures circulating on social media platforms. But I can assure you that this type of behavior is absolutely not new at all. For those who know the long history of what's called the Yellow Peril, there were Chinese massacres in the 1800s, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the shameful act of the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and then of course the hate crime in 1982, the death of Vincent Chen, who was mistaken to be a Japanese auto worker taking over the American economy, that led to his death, and ultimately the rise of major civil rights institutions within our community. So I can say that, it is disheartening. I would say that the most shocking thing for me has been this blatant attack on the most vulnerable. So particularly on the elderly, particularly on women. I think that level of cowardice and bigotry and misogyny has been a little shocking to visibly see on our feeds on a daily basis. But I would say that overall that sentiment has been part of the Asian American experience, unfortunately, for a long time. And one of the things that I'd love for us to speak about as we move forward is what can we do in terms of prevention? Because just like disease or crime, when you're in crisis mode, you want to stop the bleeding, right? By the time you're in the justice system, it's a little bit too late. And so I think that our community really has to take more of a preventative long-term perspective in terms of what we can do in face of this history.
Well, thank you for that. We will move on to a discussion about what we now do, both on the preventative side as well as community action, as well as action through the criminal justice system as well. Sylvia has pointed to the fact that this is not a new phenomenon in America, and even though I'm not an American, I've looked at all the acts of federal and state legislatures through the 20th century and certainly in the 19th century, banning various forms of Asian immigration, restricting various forms of Asian immigration, and couched in utterly racist terms. The United States is not unique in this. My own country in Australia is just as bad historically, and there is still much evidence of racial harassment, racial assault against Asian Australians as well. But Bing, same question to you. Are you surprised at all by what we've seen in the last 12 months? Over to you, my friend.
I'm a millennial who's weathered the greatest economic recession in history in 9/11. So unfortunately, no disaster surprised our generation. So that's that. The only other elements I'd add to Sylvia's very astute and comprehensive articulation of the lack of surprise is one, we all know that there's always a scapegoat for disasters. It was the Japanese during World War II. It was Muslims in 9/11. We, of course, are being scapegoated for COVID-19 that Asian Americans did not create, nor did we physically bring here. I'm not, and that being said, as Sylvia alluded to, I also want to, without decentering the Asian American experience, recognize that attacks against every single community, and particularly every minority community, are actually wrong. And if you look per capita, they're actually not even the highest against APIs. And again, I say this delicately because we're in a moment, and I want to recognize that. But when we say that an attack against one of us is an attack against all of us, that is numerically true right now because of the pandemic. So that's the only other piece I'd add. The final piece I'd say is, as Sylvia truly also articulated, a lot of people are jumping with their, posters and so forth to say we need a national and state enforced definition of hate crime. We need more enforcement and punitive measures. But the reality is, if we wait for those sticks, we will be too late. And so we have a whole slate of sort of preventative, or what I call carrot measures, that we think are just as, if not candidly, more important for long-term rectification.
Well, let's move on to that part of it. But just before we do, you've mentioned the elephant in the living room, which is COVID, and the direct attribution in the minds of many ignorant Americans between the COVID scourge, which has been inflicted on America, more than 500,000 people dead, and we have an economy which has had the guts kicked out of it. Huge impact in terms of federal government funding for stimulus payments to keep the economy rolling. And in the mind's eye of some in the United States, but obviously a significant and ill-informed minority, this is somehow the fault of Asian Americans. In the incident reporting that we've got across the country, is that part of the language that's being used directly against those who have been suffering assault in the streets? Or is it just one part of the mix? Bing, over to you first. Back to you, Sylvia.
I mean, as you know, President Rudd, the pandemic was just gasoline and fire in so many different ways, whether it was minority-owned businesses already suffering, whether it was women of color being scapegoated and penalized and fetishized in different ways. And so too in this experience, this is merely gas to a fire that is known as perpetual foreigner, where Asian American Pacific Islanders have conditional acceptance in this country. And there's a litany of different examples that Sylvia alluded to earlier, from internment to legal exclusion. You don't just see this, though, as you know, on the streets and attacks. You see this sort of pernicious perpetual foreigner, both syndrome and attacks, even in corporations, where Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are the least likely demographic to be promoted in management, according to Harvard Business Review. You, once again, are welcome to a corporation, but are not invited or integrated enough to elevate yourself. And so that, again, the net is, this is just a gas on an existing fire. And unfortunately or fortunately, it is now incumbent on our community, as well as hopefully allies, to fix this problem that we did not ask for.
Sylvia, to what extent has COVID just been the gas on a pre-existing fire? How big is it as a dynamic in what we're seeing at the moment?
I think that the pre-existing fire was absolutely there. And again, we've talked a lot about that history, and I love what's being said about the scapegoating of our community. I think that too often times the whole concept of the model minority myth, that Asians accept microaggressions. You know, when you call someone a derogatory term racially to an Asian, it's a joke. You know, we're not being the ones gunned down. We're not being the ones that are being viciously attacked. And so I think that in a way, for generations, Asian Americans have allowed these microaggressions to continually light that fire, which now COVID has just pushed over the edge. I do want to acknowledge that I do believe that some of the previous administration's characterization of the virus has contributed to some of the conception that it is okay to associate Asians with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that that's been one of the key characteristics that have also lit the fire. And I would say that a lot of the initial incidents, of course, many of them are very violent, but have also tied Asians back to the flu, whether it's Kung flu, graffiti on Asian-owned businesses, Chinese virus, go back to your country, don't bring your virus here. Those kinds of, I think, verbal articulations of how Asians are being associated. And again, once again, being seen as the perpetual foreigner or the yellow peril.
Yeah, I think we should name it for what it is. I mean, Trump's use of the term Kung flu, for example, is a repugnant act of racist politics. It's not even effective dog whistling. It's basically taking out a clarion horn and proclaiming to white America, or to non-Asian American America, that there are some people here who are appropriate targets for the scapegoating. And that, for me, just needs to be named for what it is. And before we move off it, to simply say, for anyone listening to this webcast, the bottom line is this: for God's sake, whatever the origins of the virus were in Wuhan, and that's the body of the evidence, the idea that you could in any way blame any Chinese person in the United States for what occurred in Wuhan is just mind-bogglingly stupid. Secondly, it is doubly mind-bogglingly stupid to think that a Korean American, a Japanese American, a Filipino American, the poor woman who was bashed senselessly the other day in the streets of New York, or an Indonesian American, or others from South Asia and India as well, could somehow, in any matter of logic, be held responsible, even faintly and directly, for whatever went down in Wuhan at the last part of 2019, is just so brain dead it needs to be named as such. It's just totally and utterly brain dead as a proposition. Anyway, let's get on to solutions now that we've dealt with that one. I'm really taken by the language which both of you have used in different ways. Let me use it in these, paraphrase it in these terms. You've described Asian Americans as being perpetual foreigners, that therefore, reflecting on your own experience within the United States, that you would see yourself in the eyes of white Americans and non-Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. And that the micro forms of racism are real and pernicious. As a colleague of mine said in the Asian Society the other day, whose partner is a Japanese American, there are so many things which white guys like me and him do not actually see because we are not Asian in the streets, but which, in his case, his partner sees and feels on a regular basis. So explain to me a little further about what this is like as we transition our conversation into what now do we do about it. The micro racist experiences, the sense of being the permanent foreigners, despite the fact that you're both citizens of the United States of America and have been a long time. Bing, you first, and then back to Sylvia.
I mean, like all things of being a multi-hyphenate Asian and American, there's a deep ambivalence to this, as you know, President Rudd. On the one side, for many of us, it can be incredibly hindering. What you hear is eventually what you believe and therefore how you behave and where you can and cannot go in society. If you hear that you are docile and submissive, you at some point may become docile and submissive because repetition makes prayers, makes people. But on the other side, I think the more optimistic piece that unfortunately not all of us have the privilege of having, whether it's because of our economic standpoint, our family makeup, our social acceptance, is this also makes us twice as tough. My mother used to say that you have to work twice as hard to get half as much if you're a minority in any way, which is to say you need to work 4 times as much to get just as far as everyone else. Now, that's annoying, but it's also really empowering. It means, you know, we have to actually fight back twice as hard. We actually have to out-earn twice as much to get our place. And while that can, again, be very frustrating and impossible for some, for those who have the privilege or the fortitude to get there can actually be miraculous things. I'll tease one that we'll get into sort of the longer term solutions. One of my favorite stats that we discovered at Goldhouse last year, our team discovered, was that 30% of the companies worth over $500 million founded in the last decade have at least one Asian American or Pacific Islander in this country founded. That means that 5.6% of people are controlling and contributing and leading and were invented 30% of the most valuable companies in the world. And the reason this is powerful is not just because of economic mobility, of course, for them, but these people have completely reshaped and reimagined and invented industries that have been employed and are enjoyed by many millions around the world. We're talking, of course, about DoorDash, Uber, YouTube, and so forth. And so, again, I think there's this deep duality that has, of course, like all suns cast its shadow. But as long as we can stand in the light a little bit more and enable more people to, I think in the case of startups, for instance, we can find something really special.
Well, the startup community is big, and you're part of it, my friend, and it's going pretty well. Sylvia, permanent foreigners, micro racism, and let's transition into what now is to be done.
Absolutely. First, I do want to clarify that my background is actually in Canada. So I was born and raised in Canada, so another Commonwealth country, but did experience elements of that perpetual foreigner experience as well. And I did want to also just bring to our conversation the context that a lot of times when people think of Asians, similarly as they were associating COVID to anyone that looked remotely Chinese, it is one of the most diverse communities in this country. I think those at Asian Society, we know how diverse this community is. There's over 100 languages, 50 ethnic groups, and I'm not even going into the micro subgroups. And so one of the challenges, I think, with the Asian American experience is that it is so diverse. We come from such a massive, diverse range of countries with different cultures. There are some themes that tie us all together, but I would say that, you know, even among Asians, we don't even know all the nuances. And so that diversity, the fact that we're not a monolithic community, I think lends to some of the lack of understanding about how to approach Asians and how to approach Asians in America. All to say that in terms of my experience, I agree absolutely with what Bing said. I think a lot of us are immigrants in this country. I grew up with my parents owning a convenience store. If you know the nice sitcom Kim's Convenience, that's very similar to basically my childhood. And, you know, a lot of the experiences I had was, you know, you have to work twice as hard. You know, someone calls you some kind of derogatory, says there's no such thing as Korea. You just brush it off your shoulder and you work harder. But unfortunately, I think now that I've moved to the States and have worked for civil rights organizations, I do think that that kind of mentality has sometimes perpetuated the model minority myth. And this perspective that only if we go to the top schools, only if we make it this far, only if we found this many companies or contribute this much to the economy, we will finally be accepted as full Americans. And I think what this whole pandemic has shown and has resurfaced is that the sentiment of the perpetual foreigner will not go away with no matter how much success we have as a community. What we ultimately have to do, and I know I'm jumping ahead again, but I think that the perception and the myth, the model minority, this perception that we have to work twice as hard and that's acceptable, the fact that we have to be apologetic if we feel bad that we're getting these microaggressions, all of those kinds of experiences, I think we have to now really be unapologetic and really claim that those kinds of submissive stereotypes are no longer going to be tolerated. And I can share for myself that not only do I have the sporting my short haircut, which I know is very unusual for women, there's a personal reason for that. We shaved our head to support my mother-in-law's cancer journey. My whole life, I was told that I'm not a typical Asian. I practiced criminal law. I was a litigator. I was often told, you're too loud, you need to be quiet. Whenever I walked into a courtroom in Toronto, I was often mistaken for administrative staff. Having personally experienced just how much more aggressive and assertive I need to be to say what I need to say and to be a voice, I want to ensure that my children and that generations to come no longer have to apologize for how they look and how that does not match the stereotype of an Asian American.
Yeah, it's a fascinating reflection on how facile the intellectual frameworks of let's call it white folks can be on these questions. Like, I'm not described in the United States as a European American, if you think about it. I mean, the whole notion of being European. I mean, people talk about Irish Americans. They talk about German Americans, Italian Americans, etc. And anyone with a passing familiarity of this term of convenience called Asia will know that it represents more diversity than it in fact does unity. Vast civilizations of China, Japan, the Korean Peninsula, the Malay cultures of Southeast Asia, the Khmer cultures of Indochina, before you even get close to Hinduism in South Asia and other parts in between, Buddhism in Thailand and in Myanmar, etc. This is just vastly diverse. People need to understand probably the term Asia in Latin means east. East of where? East of the West, where the white guys jumped in their boats one day to go out and discover the East. Basically quite a long time after, in fact, various Chinese navigators had discovered the West, but we'll leave that to one side. So the whole aggregate stereotype of Asian Americans is even problematic in itself because it masks so much internal diversity. Bing, on the question of what we now do, what shall be done? If you're president of the United States in 20 years' time, or you're governor of California in 10 years' time, with a government hat on, but also with a corporate hat on and a community hat on, if I was to say, here are the three things that we can and must do as of today, this day in April of 2021, to turn this beast around, what would they be?
From your lips to my mother's ears, President Rudd. I think about this once again, dualities. Unfortunately, when you're trying to reimagine socioeconomic equity, there's multiple lanes that have to move in parallel, as you know. In a perfect world, they would be sequential, but we know that's not the world we live in. So the first would be both public and private sector investments in what I call carrots and sticks. The idea on carrots is, for a functioning society, we need abundance, growth-building opportunities, prominent media portrayals that are accurate, economic investments to grow business and stabilize society, so forth and so on. But second is, we also need sticks, or corrective punitive measures when the carrots fall short, which we unfortunately know happens. The trick with sticks is we also want to make sure there are punitive measures that don't disenfranchise or disproportionately negatively impact certain communities that we know, at least in the States, have been historically biased against purely because of race. And so we need to be very careful there. The second piece is allyship. And I think about allyship in several ways, but most pronounced would be one, the origin of each of the multicultural communities experience, whether they're indigenous, First Nationers, or they're the Black community or APIs or Latinos and so forth, are highly distinct. Asians do not have universal slavery, for instance. I'm glad we don't. We also, as Sylvia astutely articulated, we also don't have any convening apparatuses that sort of try to sort of attack persecution. But the way that we will tackle these and the solutions we will find are highly concentric. And the best example in our country, as you know from this, was in the 1960s, where because of the Black Panthers, because of Black leaders like MLK Jr., because of the NAACP, Asian and Pacific Islanders, Latinos, and so forth necessarily had directly improved immigration, voting, and so forth policies because of another community's leadership. And so fortifying sincere and sustainable relationships with those other communities and finding where our concentricity can align, whether it's in the policy world or in the private sector, is of paramount importance. The final piece that I think is maybe unpopular, but is certainly critical is Asian Americans and Latinos are dual nation individuals. Because of that, we have the fastest growing immigrant populations in the country. We will be the two largest minorities in the next 2.5 decades. And I think that responsibility of being in the West and having an understanding of this soft power, but also appreciating our heritage, where so much of multinational economic growth comes from, means that it is incumbent on us to bridge the world, to bridge north and south longitudinally, and to bridge east and west across the Pacific. And so the sooner that we can identify consistent, I think, social media, not internet, social media like Facebook, but social and media, as well as economic opportunities to bridge both sides, I think the faster will also not only just engender a greater face and it's sort of a more pronounced modern face of America, but one that is economically built to weather the next few decades, just as many other superpowers already have. Exhibit A, One Belt, One Road. So those are the first two. The final piece I'd say is a mental shift. So there's this sort of perpetual, is it hard to be a CEO of a Fortune 5 or is it harder to grow your own unicorn? And the punchline is they're both challenging in their own ways. And so I would encourage our communities collectively, and I mean ours humans, the human race, to not only, as we say, build a house that is your own, invent your own companies, invent your own industries, but also invest in correcting and taking other houses that maybe is systemically more singular in their approach, whether it's in who they elevate to C-suites, who they nurture and how they nurture, or even what they value. So those are the three again, sort of private public sector investment in carrots and sticks, allyship, both with other cross-cultural communities as well as cross-continentally, particularly with South America and Asia. No offense to the other countries and continents of the world. You are also important. We are all wonderful snowflakes. And then finally, it's just that mental shift of building your own house as well as taking ones that exist.
The carrots and sticks. Okay, let's dwell for a little bit on carrots, and I'll flip to you in 1 second, Sylvia, and which in some respects is about, as you say, investment in communities, but associated with that deep attitudinal shift. What do white folks do about that, and what can and should they do about that?
I almost half want to hear from a white folk person, which would be you, President Rudd. So I'm curious there, but I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I think one, and this is easy for me to say as a minority, but as someone who is a majority in other places, I think the first mental shift is the world is not a zero-sum game. Someone else's rise in capacity, whether it's economically or otherwise, does not disenfranchise the incumbent. If it does, that means that the pie we were eating from was already limited to start out with and does not deserve to persist. And so if you look at, for instance, in media, when sort of Spotify and sort of the music services sort of started to rise, traditional terrestrial radio freaked out. They thought suddenly, here go all of our dollars, so forth and so on. But fast forward, both industries have actually risen. Now, of course, digital music is now superseded for a variety of reasons, terrestrial, but both still exist, both still thrive, and actually find that terrestrial radio, for a variety of qualitative reasons, maintains its qualitative prestige, which in the creative industry is just as important as actual hard dollars. And so I think the first mental shift is the pie grows larger, it doesn't get sliced up. How do we make it grow larger together? I think the second piece is understanding that the notion of race is not only one dimension of what's going on. Let's not forget there's gender, orientation, faith, and so forth, but also let's not forget the changing face of this country. Mixed race births and the growth of them had outpaced non-mixed race births for the past few decades, almost entirely driven because of Asian, and I mean Asian continental and South American immigration rates. And so this is not about white folk versus Asian or black versus blank. This is about, all right, how can we figure this out together? Because both biologically, but also in terms of solutions, we also have to unite there. So that's where I'd begin. The second piece would be to listen. This is really hard. I don't know, sometimes I'm a good listener, depending on who you ask. But I think it's listening to each other to figure out what we each purely need, agnostic of any system that exists. And because humans are more concentric than we are different, this has been corroborated by loads of empirical research. Punchline is we all want strong professional impact and strong familial relationships. Everybody wants the same thing. Those may manifest, of course, differently. But because humans are highly concentric in their needs, I am extremely confident and built a career on the fact that different people are able to align most of the time if we just listen. I learned this, just to give you an anecdote, at YouTube when I had to scale a partner program at the time from 33,000 partners to what became 300 million. And how do you support a large $320 billion market cap company like Disney in Burbank and an individual musician in Berlin? And the punchline is they all wanted the same 6 things that we then execute against in the exact same descending order. If artists and companies are that way, because these are run by people, I'm convinced that within social justice and so forth, we too can find very concentric solutions.
The concentric solutions are operating, as it were, in the corporate space, the entrepreneurial space, the startup space. I think if I'm hearing your argument clearly, that becomes a way of almost reverse engineering the country and pre-existing stereotypes, by which I mean, from the ground up, everyone discovers that in fact they do have concentric circles of interest. And in fact, what happens is that when you grow the pie together, frankly, everyone gets a bigger and a more interesting slice of that pie.
That's right.
As opposed to seeing these things as competitive zero-sum game pies, of which the crudest argument of the latter proposition is, you're here to take my job, which is stated at its, shall I say, at its racist worst, but polemically most effective in terms of, let's call it far-right political movements who seek to exploit that.
That's right. So, and as you know, President Rudd, a lot of those offshoring of jobs, the majority have actually been automated. They have not even been offshored. And so all the more why, and by the way, to be clear, I don't blame those individuals who feel like they are, they're being disenfranchised by other minorities. I don't agree with them. They're patently wrong. But I understand where they're coming from, and I'm not entirely sure it's their responsibility to find their own new skill set in their own bubble. I think this is where it's incumbent on private and public sectors to fix a society that we have been complicit in building. I mean, just to extend this to racism, I majored in psychology as an undergrad. People are not born racist, is the punchline. There is loads and loads of evidence that shows that racism is taught, right? And so that makes me believe and also know, once again, that people are not born bad. People are born good and pure with a tabula rasa slate. The reason they become bad is because suddenly they can't afford to put food on the table. Suddenly they cannot feed mouths. Suddenly they're being evicted. And when that happens, when you have nothing, the way that you feel like you have something again, you exert agency, sometimes by convicting or finding others who are culpable. Now, again, I don't agree with that, but I understand that experience, and therefore it's responsible on the rest of us who have that privilege to create these spaces for socioeconomic growth for all to do so.
By the way, call me Kevin. I keep looking around my shoulder to see who President Rudd is, but
our Prime Minister. Sorry. I am being ethnocentric and trying to project our titles on you.
Look, it's a feeling of an Australian minority in the United States. I'm just feeling offended, just call me.
I had earlier.
Just call me Kevin. That'll be fine.
Right.
But being as I flick to Sylvia on this, the bottom line is, any of us who've ever sat in a room with a bunch of preschoolers know that our children wonderfully are colorblind. And my 2 little grandkids are Chinese Australians. And so it is wonderful to see them in a group of multiple ethnicities. And frankly, in the world of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, this is just not even part of the consciousness. So therefore, the structural factors you alluded to are critical. Sylvia, in terms of the to-do list, you're about to become governor of California. You've beaten Bing in the primary, and you've been elected. on your way to the White House 10 years after that. And so tell me, in terms of your top three, you can use beans, carrot and sticks, or you can just go to sticks and then carrots, or whatever frame you want. What would be your top three?
Well, first, I want to actually change the structural, I think, assumption of that question, because I don't believe that you have to be the governor of California, or as being alluded to, that you have to be in some kind of elected official position to actually make a difference. So I hope you don't mind if I change that question around a little bit. And I'll say that I think that I actually wield more power as a private citizen, having access to capital, than I do sometimes as an elected official. And maybe that's just my jaded perspective after so many years in nonprofit organizations. But I will say that going back to kind of my framework of how preventive strategies are ultimately the most effective, I do believe that government and the public sector play a critical role in that. But I will say that in terms of the short-term strategies, the community, private citizens are the ones that have stepped up to the plate. And I know that Gold House has played a critical and pivotal role in really mobilizing the community and this kind of cross-sector, cross-industry, putting together celebrities with activists, the rallies that are happening, the fundraising that has been happening on GoFundMe. I think that those kind of short-term strategies have been very powerful to demonstrate, again, just the power that our community has. And there's never been more mobilization, I think, in terms of the visibility, at least. And it excites me, I think, as a hardcore advocate, to really see that kind of cross-sector collaboration. To go to the long-term strategies, and I think that's where, being shared a lot about the public-private sector, the allyship. First, in terms of the enforcement piece and the stick piece, I think having worked in the justice system and in and around the legal systems around the world, I would say that the thing that's really missing when it comes to the stick portion is a lack of cultural competency. And that's kind of a nonprofit jargony term, but anyone that provides social services to the Asian American community knows how complex that is. And again, that's going back to the fact that our community is not monolithic. We speak 10 plus different languages. So all of a sudden, when you're saying you're creating a hate crime incident reporting task force, what does that really mean for first generation immigrants that speak a variety of different languages and each have a different view on law enforcement? This is why kind of partnerships with social service and frontline community workers are so critical, because they're the ones that really know the community that they serve most. And this is also the reason why sometimes allyship is, wonderful. And I love what you shared in the beginning of the story, your anecdote of going up to that person, but perhaps that particularly individual and how they interact with public entities is going to change very much based on their ethnicity and their experience in this country. So just a little context there in terms of the stick portion. Now, in terms of my kind of wish list of three things, I would say that the three long-term strategies that I wish could be implemented, whether it's as governor or as a public-private partnership, are threefold. One is in education. So what I see is a complete disconnect at times between what's happening right now and an understanding of our history, even some of the things that we talked about during this, kind of this forum right now. And there's this disconnect in terms of the trailblazing work that a lot of civil rights activists have already done. And so I think that disconnect is a problem. And there has been a movement to incorporate Asian American curriculum within our education system. I think that needs to be done, not just for the Asian American community, but again, for those that are going to be wielding the sticks, for those that are in elected official positions. What does it mean when you say Asian? And I don't even think that elected officials understand how diverse our community is. So education to me is a long-term strategy that, will have multifaceted approaches. The other main long-stream strategy is in how do we shift culture? And I think that is where, again, groups like Gold House have done an incredible job in advocating for representation. But representation is not just in entertainment and media. It's in, the actual elected officials. It's in, who controls the media and the narrative that's actually shown to mainstream public in terms of, the culture shapers, the writers, the influencers. And so I think that's, again, another long-term strategy that we need to invest in. And lastly, as being mentioned, allyship is one of those things that I think just does not happen overnight. And, having learned of just, what happened during the LA riots, the complexity of the relationship between the Asian and the African-American community here in Southern California, what happened during those 30 years? There has been some progress. And of course, there are those who have been at the forefront of those race relation conversations. But I would say that there hasn't been enough investment. And again, this is a preventative strategy, right? It's not about putting the Band-Aid on once the bleeding started. And we have to understand that when we take a systems perspective, the model minority myth and the whole concept of white privilege is to actually pit communities of color against each other. And so I think that this whole, breakdown sometimes of the relations between the Asian American and the African American community is really ultimately perpetuating white supremacy. And so in order to really dismantle those kinds of systemic, structural, insidious, kind of forms of racism and bigotry, there has to be so much work that's put in. And, that's where I think a huge investment in terms of next gen leadership, who are going to be the ones that understand those intersectional identities, those identities that comprehend generational differences within the Asian American community, generational differences within the LGBTQ community, the African American community, and understanding just the intersectionality of those identities. That's actually the hard work, I think, that gives me hope, but I also know is also the least sexiest in terms of investment. And so I think that's where, if I could do it, those would be kind of the three large overarching things that I would love to invest in terms of preventive strategies, and with the overarching understanding that anything that's done within our community has to have a level of cultural competency. Otherwise, it's just not going to reach those that need it most.
Okay, the education, culture, allyship. And what you and Bing seem to be saying together is that if we are able to craft a better world, it's an intersecting set of almost three arrangements whereby the legislative framework establishing norms, legal norms, is clear and enforced effectively. That the re-engineering of cultural norms at the softer edge occurs through private-public partnership and can be done effectively that way, but also by corporations of the type which you've both been talking about, just growing the cake and leading by an existential reality, which is diverse firms like this grow the cake and everyone gets to become who they wish to become. And that it is the creative interplay of these three sets of dynamics which bring about aggregate change over time. Sylvia has given you about 47 shout outs for Gold House. So let me tell you, so let me ask you, what is it and what the hell are you doing that's so good? So here is your Asia Society promo for a 60-second advertisement for what are you doing that's so brilliant out there, and give us some insights.
I think the first thing is it's not me. It's our incredible 100+ person team and our incredible 1,000-person collective. So we'll start with that. The second piece is I wanted to name a silver house because I'm Asian, but we insisted on gold. The third I would say is always try harder. Great is not good enough. So welcome to Asian America.
So when's Platinum House coming?
So small tangent. For April Fool's Day, we decided it was time to have something with levity and whimsy with no goal. And so we almost renamed ourselves to Platinum House for the day, but being self-effacing felt a little more appropriate. So we renamed ourselves to Silver House for the day. But next year will be Platinum, year after will be Diamond, and we'll go from there. Anyway, in all seriousness, I think the first step is we listened. We spent a lot of time 3 years ago, and fast forward, we're now the largest API cultural leadership collective, understanding why Asians have not historically collectively convened. And it's exactly what Sylvia alluded to earlier. We are the most diverse race in the world, 50 ethnicities, hundreds of dialects stretched to every corner of the earth, or every bend of the earth. We have no historic universal struggle. Thank God we don't have a universal historic struggle. We also don't have regular convening apparatuses like Shabbat dinner or church that so many of us love and grow up in. And so the question was, what is going to unify us? Why would we even come together? Because bringing people together is one thing, getting them to stay and do something is much harder. And so to be pedantic and Kevin, so weird to call you Kevin. Kevin Rudd, I'd love to
break out of the model minority myth.
Yeah. Kevin, I would love to hear like how you think about this, especially at a country level, or continental level as well. But we realize that because Asian America as an idea is actually a legal term that's only 60 years old, less than 60 years old, excuse me, we would not be united based on our history, but what we're doing tomorrow. And I think this is hopefully empowering to people, because while we do have to shed some of our societally imposed baggage, like the model minority myth that weaponized us against the Black Panthers in particular in the 60s, as Sylvia mentioned, while we do have to shed perpetual foreigner syndrome, this is also a rally cry that our identity and cohesion is going to be based on what we can build tomorrow. And if you analogize this to what Singapore and the UAE have successfully done over the past decades and a half, they are now the economic powerhouses for all of Asia and the Middle East, successfully, dare I say I'll get in trouble, but displanting Hong Kong and Japan, period. And it's because they united on money, because they united on something that is universal language that makes the world go round. So that insight was profoundly important to us. Now, what do? We have a systemic approach to engendering greater socioeconomic equity. So on the socio side, we collaborate and are the first API call for every major Hollywood studio, where we consult culturally on the authentic portrayal of APIs and scripts for films, all the way to ensuring the successful opening weekends, all the way to ensuring the successful wins. Now, I know this sounds a little soft because we all look at media and we think it's a little vain, it's a little frivolous, but the reality is that 80% of media traditionally that's exported worldwide comes from the United States. So what we produce within the confines of Hollywood, within the World Trade Center in New York City, is necessarily what the world believes. And when you look at film as a format, film is still widely regarded as the high art. Now, music and sport and TV will sometimes be progenitors to things like diverse inclusion and casting and so forth. But the reality is nothing is taken seriously until film moves. And so we built this end-to-end funnel to ensure that our stories were accurately and prominently told, and have so many times made history. And we are the dominant marketing reason why Parasite, a mostly non-English film, was the best performing film by per theater average opening weekend pre-pandemic. And so being smart about what unites us through money, speaking the language of old systems and thinking about it from an end-to-end approach is one part. The other part, just to end this out, and this is where Sylvia and I actually spend our day jobs in many ways, but is on the economic side. We know that C-suite executives and board directors make decisions. There are two paths there. One, you can go through a traditional corporation and by God love you if you have succeeded there. Maya Korangal, Arise Fund, Mark Tatum over the NBA, Mani Macedo, Worldwide CEO Bain. We love all of them. We celebrate their journey, Indra Nui. But the reality is there are very few of those spots and those take decades to get to. And so instead we focus on small businesses or startups or Main Street as they call it in Washington, DC. And as I mentioned earlier, 5.6% of this country is delivering 30% of the top companies that have reimagined industries. That is a great source of power, not just because you are your C-suite if you found your company, but you control your board and who gets on from day one. And so anyway, so we have just a comprehensive slate of stuff there. I think the final piece is really important is we were never built for and by Asians. As a third culture kid who grew up not seeing himself as Asian, but first and foremost as a human being, it's fundamentally important to me that we not just build singularly and selfishly. It's important that we, and our mission is really targeted towards socioeconomic equity for APIs, but in order to put us in a position to serve, unite, and lead so many other communities, whether it's because we have this Pacific Bridge responsibility, whether it's because we should just deploy our resources to others because it's cardinal law or otherwise. So let's go last in a nutshell. Can go into much more detail, but that's that.
I know, Kevin, and I hope you don't mind if I share just another reason why I think I was making those shout outs and also make a couple of other shout outs, because actually it ties back to because it does tie back to Asia Society. I will say that when I joined Asia 21 in 2016, I was full-fledged in civil rights and international human rights policy. You go into law school thinking that that's how you're going to change the world, using law using policy. And my specialty area was North Korean human rights, which, Kevin, if you know at all, in DC has not really moved the needle very much over the past decade. So all to say, I was a very serious international human rights scholar. I just completed my master's in law, and I came to Asia 21 in Seoul. It was a Seoul summit in 2016. And the keynote speaker that year was Neil Cross. And he was known as the world's most disruptive innovator. And I will tell you that it blew my mind. Actually, Asia 21 was very special to me because it was in that room full of entrepreneurs, many of them social entrepreneurs, and many of them advocates, but experiencing and executing advocacy in such innovative, creative ways that a new Sylvia was really born. And I always joke around that that was the moment where I knew that what I was doing in terms of my advocacy and human rights work was not effective. And I had to be very honest that there are different ways to solve problems. And that's, many years fast forward, why I'm now a venture capitalist who invests in early stage technology. And so actually, there's an incredible book called The Medici Effect, which it's a best-selling business book. It's about innovation. And it's really about when you intersect different unlikely things together that the greatest innovations occur. And so I think Gold House is definitely an example of that. To me, it was an innovative approach to Asian American civil rights advocacy. There are many other examples. For example, I know that I'm involved with a group called NFT for Good that are now using non-fungible tokens in the crypto world to also advocate for what's happening against Asians. There are things that I see every day that are intersecting technology, very age-old social impact perspectives, women founders, diverse founders, and making sustainable impact. And so I think for me, it's just really opened my eyes that when you want to move the needle, when you do the same thing over and over again and it's not working, it's time to change the method. And I think that when Gold House came onto the Asian American scene, at the time we were just launching the National Asian American Community Foundation, it was such a fresh breath of air and an example of what third culture, next generation folks are going to bring to the table. And I say that in hopes in raising two children myself and knowing that, their approach to the world, their approach to their Asian American identity and their kind of unlikely intersections of how they're going to be approaching these age-old problems of race relations, of xenophobia. These are things that, I don't even think we're ever going to uproot them actually, but how do we manage them? It's almost like a chronic disease, but I think that those fresh and different perspectives, I think has really shaken, the community. At the same time, of course, we need to have those connections to the trailblazers and to the anchors and those that have those lived experiences. But to me, that kind of innovative intersection and the reason why I'm currently in my day job now in the space of VC and innovation really actually roots back to my Asia 21 summit in Seoul.
We owe Asia Society, I feel like, commission multiple times. There should be an Asia Society fund. We're all 1%.
Exactly.
Well, don't worry, I'm the new president CEO. We're going to set one up for you guys. So.
Would not be unwise.
Because no, the bottom line is, I think the Asia 21 vision of not me, not my immediate predecessor, but Vishaka, when she was president of the Asia Society way back when, 2006, was really ahead of its time in, frankly, creating a creative crucible for dealing with these challenges long term. And so I'm just delighted that not only have you benefited from the experience, but it's actually ignited a creative impulse in the cerebral cortex and in the amygdala to go and do stuff differently. And I think Sylvia's reflection is really so important. The definition of insanity is to keep banging your head against the wall, doing the same thing year in, year out, and finally discovering at the age of 65 that doesn't quite work. To which the answer should be innovate and go differently. And if we can be, as the Asia Society, a crucible for that, not just in a formalized campaign and support and solidarity with Asian Americans, but reinventing the paradigm, which is what you two guys are on about. Film, how people are presented, terrific. And that is deeply shaping economic opportunity, financial possibility, growing the pie. These all, as it were, shatter the old static as it were, paradigm of us v them, whoever the us happens to be at a particular point in history and whoever the them happen to be. Now, we've got a bunch of questions which are rolling in the door. So there'll be a very simple rule of thumb here. Anything that's really easy, I'll try and answer. But anything that's really tricky, you two can answer, if that's all right. So,
do we have this?
No, because
because you're president,
yeah,
and we're just so close.
That's great. I've just gone from Kevin to president again. So
life comes full circle, don't you know?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, I'll just run through these questions so that we can use the next half hour productively, interactively. Andrew asks via email, what can we say to those who insist on equating Chinese people with China? It's happening in chat too. Poor relations between the US and China contributing to this? I think so, he says. What's the best way to explain that Chinese people shouldn't be treated as some sort of fifth column? Well, that goes to a very rich debate, which has been around since the McCarthy period. Who wants to take a crack at that first?
Go ahead, Sylvia.
Start
with the smarter one.
No, what are you talking? No, I mean, I think that's kind of the age-old question. And again, that goes to my long-term strategy of education, right? It's ultimately, I think, a lack of understanding about the complexity of Asian American history, whether it's, in whichever country you exist in, of kind of the history and the patterns of immigration that lead to those kind of simple associations that are really oversimplified, of course. I mean, I think that the change in mentality will take generations. But this is where I believe in the education system. I'm not saying it doesn't have its flaws, but that's where, the education system can provide that context that when you're seeing a Chinese person in your classroom, there's a difference between a fifth generation Chinese, Chinese American, for example, versus a first generation recent immigrant from China. And I think that all comes down to just the nuance of education. And, that happens, of course, within institutions and outside of institutions. It also happens in terms of film, in terms of how culture and stories are shared. So I would say that, that kind of, in fact, validates, I think, that long-term strategy that we need to do a better job in terms of educating ourselves and educating those around us, including whatever society we live in, that when you say Asian, it's a very complex thing. It's not just Chinese. It's not just Korean, or it's not just Filipino. It's just, it's a very complex ethnic group. And I mean, when you say Chinese, we're not even going to get into it, but, we're not talking about regions and dialects and, all of the different cultural nuances that exist when you say the overarching term Chinese as well.
Yeah, that's, so Sylvia, your surname is Kim. I take it from that you're not Irish, you're probably Korean American. My surname is Rod.
Telltale sign.
Telltale signs. My surname is Rudd, so I'm not Japanese. I just want to put that out there on the table. I'm not Rudd or Sam. So I'm boringly Anglo-Celtic. Bing Chen sounds, as a student of Chinese language myself, I'm taking a wild punt, Bing Chen, that your background is Chinese American. Xing Chen, and then 就是这样子. And so on the core question which is being asked, which comes directly out of Kung Flu, which comes directly out of, let's call it, the broader dynamics of the US-China relationship, which is what I spend most of my day job on, by the way, as the head of the Asia Society, and US-China relations and where it goes. And it's all going bad at the moment, has been for quite a while. Do you have any reflections on, frankly, the difference between the 92 million members of the Chinese Communist Party who actually drive, as it were, the machine in the Chinese state, the other 1.3 billion Chinese who are not members of the Chinese Communist Party within the PRC, and the tens of millions of Chinese who make up the Chinese diaspora around the world? So some reflections from you, my friend, given that you're the only non-Irish, non-Korean member of our gathering of three. So over to you.
Wow, you give me the hard one. I would say something that Sylvia once again said really astutely is we need to grow up and understand that simple associations have enormous fallacies. I mean, I think about, for instance, when we boycott companies, for instance, and try to call out CEOs, especially for traditional companies. We're not penalizing the CEO or company, we're penalizing the lower echelon workers who were not complicit in these decisions. And so I think just using education, not just in schools, but even modernly with adults is of vital importance. I think the second thing, just to translate this to a specific industry, because this is one of those questions that's so broad, we can quickly just meander around 5,000 different lily pads. But one area that I think about this particular pernicious recently for us is within media and the malreporting of the Atlanta murders, 6 of which, as we know, were Asian women, and all of which were lower income. And I think about specific thing that media can do here to reshape our public opinion about individuals and or other countries and their actions is first and foremost that precision really matters. Nouns really matter. So you just alluded to, President Rudd, you're still upgraded, is Kung Flu. There, as Sylvia alluded to this earlier, but there have been studies on studies that indicated that the favorability of Asian American Pacific Islanders in the United States actually rose for decades since the 60s. Now there's a dark side to that, but still rose nonetheless and actually plummeted by multiple percentages the second that Trump said Kung Flu and China virus. And so nouns really matter. I'm gonna invoke another example, because I realize this sounds small, but remember, nouns can shape mentality and approach, which shapes policy. I distinctly remember when NBC became the first broadcast network to outlaw the term alien and illegal immigrant in favor of undocumented. This, by no coincidence, led to a direct windfall of favorable policies from DACA and otherwise. I'll give you one more that's animate but non-human. It was a bunch of nostalgic Apollo astronauts who took the famous picture of the blue marble that when you Google Earth, you see. And by no coincidence, that nostalgic set of astronauts set off within 2 years the official Earth Day and favorable and really landmark environmental policies. So again, precision in imagery and language absolutely matters and is where this starts. I think the second piece that matters is cultural fluency. So Sylvia alluded to this earlier, but investing in reimagining, all of what we have known to be true. Exhibit A, I just got 4 new plants because I'm millennial and it's all the only living thing I can take care of. A pet would just die. I asked my friends, what should I name them? And I landed on Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, because I think I'm adorable. And the reality is Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo actually comes from a anti-Black racist rhyme. And so obviously they're not eeny, meeny, miny, mo anymore, but relearning things like that, relearning that Thanksgiving is actually a very problematic holiday, as much as we all love Black Friday, is really, really important. And so this only happens when we bring those who are afflicted, who have been written out of history, because history is ruled by victors, which means society is still ruled by victors. Bringing them to the table and getting cultural fluency is really important. In the media industry, this means hiring and empowering and elevating people who look a certain way and have certain lived experiences. Exhibit A in Atlanta, if you read the Korean language reporting of the victims in particular, and not say all Korean, but if you read that, it was deeply human. They were looking at the victims' histories and lived experiences and so forth. If you read anything from English media, it was all trying to humanize the murdered domestic terrorists. The fact that, for instance, I still lament this, that I knew that he went to church before I knew the stories of 6 Asian women and 8 innocent victims is a travesty. That is a failure of media. And so cultural fluency by engagement of victims and those who've been historically disenfranchised is number 2. And then third, and this gets back to the proverbial fake news issue and what's real, what's not, we're overloaded with information, is making sure that we're investing in platforms and publishers that are that are hell-bent on delivering the truth when it really matters. So I realize I'm not directly answering a question, but I think it's really important for these broader questions that we narrow down. And because media is half of my life, I think that's one place we can action against now.
And what strikes me on the cusp of China's emergence as the world's largest economy, this is just me attempting to answer the question that's been thrown at us as well, is, and I say this as a white guy, is just how monumentally ignorant white Americans are and white Australians are of the complexity of Asian history and culture. And this is a monumental failure of our collective education systems. I'm a guy in Australia who 25 years ago began a campaign for the teaching of Asian languages in Australian schools: Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Indonesian. And it's had faltering success over the years. But you know something, the take up still of these critical languages of the continent and the hemisphere of the future, which is the Eastern Hemisphere. The Eastern Hemisphere. If you simply put all the economic aggregates together, it's the Eastern Hemisphere. Then the appalling ignorance about, let's call it the history of the three kingdoms on the Korean Peninsula, what has been the history of China and Japan, what has been the internal and contested history of China itself, for which the current communist period is frankly a drop in the ocean compared with how China has evolved through 2,000 years of imperial history, and prior to that, the divided kingdoms before the unification under the Qin. And similarly, you know, the ignorance of India, etc. And so there has to be a revolution, frankly, in, let's call it, white guys' consciousness, that understanding otherness is not just some, as it were, cute multicultural moray. It is now absolutely essential to understanding the world which is about to come crashing down on your shores. And getting that message through the cerebral cortex of a bunch of Anglo-Celtic Americans and Anglo-Celtic Australians is a challenge. Next question. This is, again, really sharp and deeply sensitive, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Michael Che Kim asks via YouTube, why do you think ordinary non-Asian minority Americans are also attacking Asian Americans? And of course, the sharp focus there is what unfolded on the streets of New York against that poor Filipino-American woman recently. Reflections on this, please. I know it's hard and it's tough, but let's go for it.
I can start with this. It is incumbent on all of us, especially those of us who are young, millennials and centennials, not to see race first, but to see shitty people first, period. If you attack someone else, you are a bad person, or at least you are doing a bad thing. That is our priority first. Now, second, a lot of people who've levied this sort of race issue, and then the punchline is they think they want us to say that it is the Black community attacking the API community. I won't say that because A, that's counter to allyship, and B, this grossly simplifies the experience here because A, no one has shown the data of any of the race, the aggregate race of attackers. Two is, let's not forget, society has been systematically stacked against certain communities. And it's not just Black and brown communities, by the way, and Black and Latino communities. It's also different different forms of Asians, different ethnicities, different regional density, and so forth. And you actually find that crime often coincides not with race in this case, but actually with low income. And so we can't overly simplify this experience. So if that's first and foremost, we need to see these people as these are human beings who are doing bad things. That's that. The second piece that we need to be complicit in, and our friends at NACP have actually been awesome on this, is yes, there are some of us that have historic systemic biases that have pitted us against each other. And in the case that Sylvia alluded to earlier of mono-minority with the Black community in particular, used as a racial wedge by old incumbents in the 60s, needs to be dismantled by us, even though we did not create it. Right. And so this is, once again, as my mother sometimes says, we have to solve problems we never asked for. This is our responsibility now. So addressing the anti-Blackness in this case from this question, I think, within the Asian community is our responsibility. The other side is also being smart enough. There are so many Black allies. I mean, I can give anecdote on anecdote. Rihanna was at the Stop Asian Hate protest this weekend in New York City. NACP, the night that Atlanta happened, the president of Georgia called all of us and said, what can we do? So grossly simplifying this as a race battle is A, the wrong thing, because this is a human being issue. And then second is, it is getting in the way of progress where we are going to need other communities at a transactional level to fix it.
I love that thing. I don't know if I have much more to add other than that, again, going back to the complexity of race relations. Again, these things just don't happen overnight. And I think because there hasn't been a lot of investment into authentic race relationship building, again, between the LA riots until now, is the reason why there's this oversimplification of what's happening right now. I also want to add the whole sexism and misogyny aspect that's been happening a lot with these incidents as well. And I think that that's part of the intersectional conversation that's been missing out. But a lot of the attacks have overwhelmingly been on elderly women. And there's this perception that, you know, women are just easier targets, of course, notwithstanding what happened in Atlanta as well. And so I think that there's just so many layers here. And this is the reason why it's difficult to jump to conclusions without putting in the hard work of really understanding and building up race relations, as being so articulately mentioned, in terms of moving us forward beyond this moment to actually preventing further incidents down the road.
It'd be great, given the history of, as you said, minorities being pitted against each other in the United States, formally or informally, as that's evolved. If we could move ahead in our mind's imagination a few years, and we have in the Washington Mall the "We Have a Dream" speech with leaders from the NACP, leaders from the Asian American communities, leaders from the Latino community, which is we have a dream of a multicolored America. It's because it's as if you need some large national symbolic event which basically puts to the sword this idea that people can be pitted against each other. That in fact this is a unity proposition for all people who have been on the receiving end of racist treatment in the United States over the years, over the decades. So thank you for that. Last question that I've got is from Monica. Monica asks via email, what advice do the speakers have for Asian Americans like myself to get involved right now? And what advice for others who would like to do the same? And how also can non-Asian Americans accompanying Asians help to prevent assault? So let's take the first part first, which is, and we've got about 10 minutes left in our conversation. If you want to get active now and you're someone who's watching YouTube bright and shiny things, Bing and Sylvia talk about the world and what can be done differently, and you're just beginning on this journey, but you want to get involved, what's your advice? Your experienced folks. Start with you, Sylvia, and then I'll come to Bing.
I think Bing can probably mention all of the different groups that are involved, because I haven't been as active in the space in the past recent year, but I will say that a lot of wanting to be involved can also start with self-education. And that's just being aware, again, of the long history. There's so many incredible Asian American resources out there. I think there's an incredible documentary on PBS. There's incredible authors, films, and I think is just kind of understanding the context of the moment that we're living in, because I think that will ultimately make however you participate the most meaningful and the most sustainable. So I think, an immediate thing is kind of educating ourselves, understanding what's out there. Then I think the other thing is understanding the local coalition. So depending on where, I think it's Michelle that lives, wherever she lives, it could be, the Atlanta, Georgia community mobilized very quickly. And there were these incredible trainings and town halls and opportunities to really share and bond with local community members. And I think that's so critical for activism, because this moment is going to pass. And my goal as an advocate is, how can we make sure that the emotions we felt in this moment, this desire to get involved, is sustained beyond this moment? And the only way you do that is to build authentic relationships with like-minded people. And so my second advice would be, look into kind of local civil rights organizations. I'm sure Bing and myself can also be a resource if there's any help in connecting with some of that. And then of course there's the national organizations, and there has been plenty of national mobilization opportunities. It was very moving to see Stand with Asian Americans. That was a new website and a pledge, and it was a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal. I think that's a petition that you can sign. There's so many other, I think you could probably know the specifics, pledges and GoFundMe's and campaigns that you can donate to. And so many rallies, I think, happening almost on a weekly basis. But I would say a lot of it, to me, my strategy and kind of philosophy in life has always been inwards, outwards. So, kind of starting from inward first and, reflecting and making sure that whatever I do outwardly is out of that overflow and understanding.
Okay, Bing, I want to become involved tomorrow. I'm watching this webcast with you, two bright and breezy things. How do I become involved?
I would just honestly echo what Sylvia said. I think first and foremost, everyone feels like they need to do something that is not endemic to who they are. I need to donate to an organization I've never heard of. I need to go volunteer for something I've never done before, so forth and so on. That's all fine and well. But the reality is, the more concentration you can find between your day job and your core skills and the fight that is so multidimensional and by definition requires everyone and everything, the better. So I just, for instance, spoke with one of the large asset management firms this morning, trillions under management. And all of them are saying, we just process money. What do we do? Well, you can actually externalize the way you process money to all these small businesses. By the way, 30% of which to 50 in many large cities are dying and will never come back. And not only give them sort of more favorable loan access that they traditionally haven't had, but also just education. So starting where you're strong in your lane and trying to figure out how you can extend that to others, both as a cardinal imperative, but potentially a commercial opportunity, is number one. The second piece I'd say is I really love what Sylvia said of really starting local. I know this is sort of like the narrative now and it seems cute, but the reality is, even with great national organizations, whether it's Gold House or Asian Americans Advancing Justice, we will never have the level of specificity that a local organization provides because we are not on the ground all the time like they are. And so being able to donate time and money to local organizations, you can find the largest list of them at gofundme.com/AAPI. There's a whole list that you can donate directly to or to a mega fund that is all tax deductible, that's providing relief. I think the third piece is, as Sylvia just mentioned, this is a little bit of a carouseling for causes. I'm really worried the world is going to forget about this in a few months, right? And so consistency of activation is really, really, really important and demonstrates sincere commitment. This is all the more reason why people should focus on where they're strong. And then the final pieces are just make sure that you take a mental break. I'm candidly exhausted today. The context switching, the volume of calls we've had to add, and the amount of things we're trying to do, and I feel like it's great, but it's never enough, is taxing. And so getting a massage, listening to your therapist, and getting, meditating, ordering that Chicago deep dish pizza, ordering delicious Garrett's popcorn from Chicago, is really, really important. I'm projecting. I just did all those things in 48 hours. It's really, really important. And then the final piece is allyship, of course, making sure that we figure out how we get there together. The only other thing, President Brown, I'd love to impress on folks is we need to learn, as Sylvia alluded to earlier, from others. And unfortunately, others' travesties are the most educational for us. And the reason this narrative of local, community, and individually driven power is so critical and needs to be the narrative, the principal narrative, is look at what has happened to the Black community. Slavery was outlawed in this country by the 13th Amendment in 1865, but it was years and then decades before, as so many of us know and have said, before they could own property, vote, marry interracially, so forth and so on. And still to this day, a young woman named Breonna Taylor, a young man named Trayvon Martin, who are innocent Black Americans, cannot live the night. So let's be very clear. Laws, private sector investments, a historic summer of reckoning with protests and Black Lives Matter is still not enough. And so what is going to be enough? As once again, my mother used to say, if you wait for something to be handed to you, you will wait to death. And so this is, once again, incumbent on each of us. And that is where it starts, as Sylvia said, inward to outward, to get this right. And you start with where you are strong and where you spend most of your time.
Yeah, I'm still transfixed on the looking after yourself one. So, and what you did in the last 2 hours before you came on the program, and that you're exhausted. But harnessing our own individual, frankly, talents and resources is really important. But the core message you seem to be delivering me is, and through me to those who are watching this webinar and participating in it, is act within your lane and act locally, and make a difference where you are, in your workplace, in your community, in your church, in your gathering. And I suppose I'd add to that, the next time you hear a piece of racist shit from somebody, throw it back in their face. Just throw it back in their face. Because there's something about norm setting, which is not just from governors and presidents and prime ministers. It's frankly norm setting when you're in the elevator. It's norm setting when you're in the street, when you're norm setting when you're in the store and you hear someone say something bad to Mrs. Kim Sr., who's running the convenience store. And you just say, that's just so much shit, shut up. I think, as you said before eloquently, being a shitty behavior should be defined as such. And all of us have a responsibility to call that out. Last few minutes, we're here at an Asian Society gig. And you're all from Asia 21. For those who don't know what Asia 21 is, it's a secret society of Illuminati, which we've carefully cultivated over the last, no, it's not. And we all send you secret capes and hats to wear on special occasions. But we gather together bright and breezy, innovative young leaders, frankly, from across the countries of Asia, including the United States, including my own country, Australia, at least annually, and now through virtual communities much more regularly than that, to think through together common challenges which face the future. We now have an alumni network of 1,200, which has grown over the last 14 years. And I'm thinking as President and CEO of the Asia Society about how we take it forward into a new chapter, and not just on the subject that we're dealing with, but more broadly as well. So if you were me and you're president of the Asia Society, then where would you take Asia 21 on this question, which we're gathered on today, which is turning back the tide and changing the tide, frankly, on the future of Asian Americans?
So do you want to go first?
Okay, I can go first, sure. I mean, I think that the Asia 21 network is very global in nature. And I think that sometimes the US-centric approach, I think, doesn't maximize the potential of the network. Because I think for me, especially when I was in Seoul, the thing that I really felt, and being, I can't remember where your year, was it in the US for you, your year?
Yes, San Francisco.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So for me, I think because it was in Korea and, there were so many people from all over the world, I really felt like there was such a global community and a new hope to kind of address complex global problems in such an innovative, fresh way. So I will say that actually, I think that's one of the strengths of Asia Society and Asia 21. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from that global community in terms of application here in the US. And I think that sometimes those voices also aren't amplified as much in terms of the solutions they may have in each of their local communities. So I would say for me, I feel like Asia 21, I've always, I think I haven't turned down a speaking engagement yet. Anytime they've asked me, I think it's an incredible community, but I also often wish like there were more opportunities to just hash out ideas and actually understand where those connection points are. Because I think that the community is so diverse and again, has such a unique global perspective. And I think going back to kind of the insanity of doing the same things over and over again, perhaps that kind of innovative global perspective is exactly what's needed in this moment here in the US when we're facing this level of xenophobia and violence. And I have a feeling that many Asia 21 members will have felt some level of xenophobia in each of their countries as well. So I think there's just a lot to be learned from that global perspective, and would love to kind of find that. Obviously it's difficult virtually, but have always just felt that sometimes it's just, I don't even know who's in the network and what voices we're missing. And I think that's something that's something that I would love to kind of facilitate, I guess, and somehow. I don't know, Bing, go ahead.
I completely agree, actually. I think it's two things. Community building has to at once be structured and dictated from the top, specifically the Asia 21. Here are the specific challenges we think worldwide for younger folks are the most pressing. How do we solve this together, and creating very specific programming and getting there. But then secondly is also creating fluid communication lines where people can just share what they're doing to find sort of concentric points. And both need to happen The only other piece I'd say is my model for everything for better and worse is the Walt Disney Company and church. And so I think for this, it's church, where churches get together weekly on Sundays. If you're Christian, for instance, afterwards they have barbecue, so there's a social element. They also have Bibles or manifestos that you go back and read and can teach others and evangelize. We can debate all day long whether any of that is good or not anymore for everybody, but the lesson remains that so too building a community, just as the church has done more powerfully than any other cultural institution in history to date, I think is really instructive. So, what is the Asia 21 manifesto? Maybe it's a list, sort of like the Millennium Goals, of the most prescient topics for young folks. Number two, our convening every Sunday. Maybe there is a Zoom every Sunday or once a month just to get everyone together. That's of course followed by some PG rated happy hour, and so et cetera, sponsored by Foster's now. So forth and so on. So I think those two lanes though are really important.
I'm Australian. We never do PG. We only do M. So
fair enough. Good man. You were allowed to say that. I am not.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, you'll hear more from me and more from the Asia Society on the future of Asia 21. I regard it as the Asia Society's future. And so therefore, it's both building the community, the regularity of its interaction. As a practicing Anglo-Catholic, I understand the church analogy, but also to take up a point from Sylvia, it's also coalescing around individual problems to be solved. And so one of the convenings that I'll be putting together soon with Margaret, who introduced us today, who's the head of our Northern California Center of the Asia Society, is an expanded task force on what we practically do as individuals, as an institution, to roll back this tide on Asian Americans, and to prove being wrong, that this will not fade in 3 months' time. As I keep saying to my own team, we actually have the name Asia Society. I hear a bugle call, which is we are being summoned to duty right now on this question that we're all talking about, including us white guys, and we must therefore act. So Asia 21 strikes me as very much the Pope's battalions on these questions. So there you go. Listen, Sylvia, thank you so much for spending an hour and a half of your precious time with us. And I'm sorry to pull you out of your jacuzzi, Bing, for the purposes of spending a hard-working hour and a half with us. You can go back to jacuzzi. you can go back to the tender nurturing of your soul after this. But it's been a fun conversation. Thank you for sharing this time with us. And for those of you who are watching this webinar, you wish to contact us in the Asia Society with your own contribution, go to our website. Please email it in and get connected to what we're doing as an institution which is trying to do good, not just in the United States, but in the world, on causing this scourge of racism to become a minor footnote in 21st history rather than a dominant theme. So thanks, folks. Thanks, Bing. Thanks, Sylvia. And we look forward to catching up with you soon.